everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is the final part of the Moor's Murders series. Before we get started, I want to wish a couple of my patrons who celebrated their birthday in the month of May a happy birthday. Obviously, this is going to post probably in the beginning of June, but I did have a couple of patrons who had birthdays in May, and I want to wish them a very happy, if belated, birthday. Happy birthday to Christine, who celebrated her birthday on May 15th. Happy birthday to Molly Grace, who celebrated her birthday on the 16th of May. Happy birthday to Faye Ramirez Andujar, I hope I pronounced that right, I'm so sorry if I didn't, who celebrated her birthday on May 26th. Happy birthday to Jane Thorpe, who celebrated her birthday on May 30th. And happy birthday to Danny, who celebrated her birthday on the 29th, and it's Danny with an I. My sister is also a May birthday. She's the 24th. Crazy Gemini, but I love her. And one of my favorite aunts is also in May, also a crazy Gemini, but crazy in the old Italian grandmother kind of way. You know, like, eat something, you look like you're starving. That's my Tita Nini. That's what I call her, Tita Nini. Even though her name is Henrietta, everybody calls her Nini. So happy birthday to all my May loves, Patreons, friends, and family. Secondly, I did make a community post about what I plan to be doing in the month of October, which is basically a, not daily, but at least 5 times a week. I want to do kind of a spooky Halloween-themed video, something a little scarier, something a little bit more mysterious, and we'll still do our true crime videos, but I do want to add those in because Halloween and fall, Halloween's my favorite holiday. Fall is my favorite season. I love everything spooky. I love everything Halloween. I am just a crazy, crazy Halloween-loving person. So are all my kids. Nev, my daughter, my oldest daughter, she's born in October, so we've always kind of shared that as well. And I really want to share my love of that with you guys. So I had asked you guys, what should we call it? And give me some ideas of what you want to see in videos. And officially, it's going to be called Harloween, which is awesome. Why didn't I think of that myself? You guys are absolutely brilliant. It's the best name ever. I'm so excited. And some people were like, well, I don't really want to see creepy pastas or anything that's not real. I'm not going to talk about anything that's not real. I used, like Slenderman and the Black-Eyed Kids as like examples. I may do a couple of those videos, urban legend kind of things, but really it's just more creepy stuff like the Kennedy curse and the Georgia Guidestones. I have a lot of ideas actually, so I don't want to give anything away, but things like that. They're true, they're historically based, but they're creepy. So look forward to that in October. I know it's only June, so it seems like I'm planning ahead, but I, A, am a big planner, B, can't wait for fall and Halloween, and C, obviously would like to start researching those things now so I can make sure I get them up for you guys in a timely manner when October hits and still make time for all my hay rides and apple picking. All right, let's get started on part 3 of the Moor's Murders video. When we last left off in part 2, Leslie Ann Downey had just been discovered. Her body had just been discovered on the moors. When Ann West was brought to the morgue to identify the body of her 10-year-old daughter, half of Leslie's body was covered by a sheet. One of the detectives who was at Saddleworth Moor when her body was found was both disgusted and surprised to see that basically half of her body had been perfectly preserved almost, while the other half was badly decomposed. They used the sheet to hide the decomposing half from Anne when she came to identify Leslie. The distraught mother looked down at her lifeless child and winced when she noticed that her lips were swollen, as if she had bitten down on them very hard. She said, quote, "She had always been a quiet girl, but this silent stillness was something I had not experienced before." On October 18, 1965, Ian and Myra both appeared in court for a remand hearing. When Myra left the van that had transported her to the court, she was surprised to see that she was being greeted by an angry mob. Since Leslie's body had been discovered, Ian and Myra had gained a kind of notoriety for being savage and ruthless and child killers. I think it was from this point on that the public began to see Myra Hindley for what she was, and they would never see her as an innocent accomplice or another victim of Ian Brady again. That day, she was formally charged with being an accomplice to the murder of Edward Evans. They met with Ian's lawyer privately to discuss how they were going to fight these charges. They took this time to express their love for each other. Now, if you remember, Ian had never said the words "I love you" to Myra before, But now I believe that he had a special interest in having her believe that he really did. And I'm not sure if Ian Brady ever really did love Myra Hindley. I'm not sure if Ian Brady was ever really even able to love anything or anyone. But he told her in these private moments with their lawyer that he loved her because he wanted to keep her hanging on. He wanted to give her the belief that there was something there worth fighting for, which was their relationship and their bond and their love. Ian was the first one to be interviewed about the death of Leslie Ann Downey. The detectives walked into the room and they threw down on the table in front of him her shoes, her socks, and the white beads that had been found with her. They told him they knew that these things belonged to the same child that had been seen in the pictures that were found in his suitcases. Ian had nothing to say about the photographs, but when they brought out the tape recorder and played it for him, he bowed his head as he listened, trying to act remorseful or just trying to focus. I'm not sure which. Ian did not deny that it was Leslie Ann Downey. He did not deny that it was his voice and Myra's on that tape recording, but he did say that 2 other men had brought Leslie to his house that night, and that after he had finished taking pictures of her, they left with Leslie, and he never saw the girl again, and he didn't know what happened to her after that. Next, Myra was interviewed about Leslie, and she was also faced with Leslie's belongings, the black wig that she had worn that had been found in the suitcases, and the pictures and the tape recording. Myra acted as if she was upset and horrified, covering her mouth and her face with her hands and looking down in the same way that Ian had. When they played the tape for her, she pretended to be horrified and ashamed at what happened. She began to cry, but she still refused to say anything about the abduction of the young girl. Even though Myra and Ian were still trying to implicate David Smith in these murders, in these crimes, he stuck to his story. It never changed. The police did suspect him for a while. They thought that it was too convenient for him to have been so involved with Myra and Ian before and then all of a sudden turn on them. So they did do a lot of investigating into his background. They talked to people who knew him, his employers, his neighbors. They even talked to his father. So obviously, word started to get around that David Smith was possibly connected to these deaths and had possibly been more involved in these murders than he claimed or admitted. The police questioned him many times, like I said, but his story never changed, so eventually they let it go. But the public, the neighborhood, his town, his city, nobody there let it go. And this belief that he was involved became widespread. Since Leslie had been discovered on Saddleworth Moor, the search was allowed to continue, and Mounsey took every single call from somebody who had a tip that they'd seen Ian and Myra on the moors, or from anybody who said they might know where the locations of more kids were buried would be found. He enlarged pictures from Ian and Myra's album and compared them to possible sightings. He passed these pictures out to people who lived around the moor, people who would be more familiar with the terrain, to see if any of them could pinpoint areas that they recognized. Arthur Benfield was still pushing for this investigation to be wrapped up. He brought Mounsey into his office and he closed the door and he basically told him, get off the moors and get back to work. Benfield even publicly said in one of his many press conferences that he did not believe there was any more bodies buried on that moor. Still, Saddleworth Moor was flooded with people. Reporters hoping to be present if another body was discovered, passerbyers who stopped to stare at the police officers walking around poking sticks into the ground. Some even considered it a spectator event, bringing along picnic lunches and settling in for the day. Detective John Tyrrell was searching through the bookshelves at Wartlebrook Avenue when he discovered Myra's childhood prayer book and inside the luggage ticket. Suddenly, the code that was used in the disposal plan that had been found in Myra's purse, it made a little bit more sense. Some of these letters used in the code were PB and TIC, and Tyrrell now realized that PB stood for prayer book and TIC stood for ticket. Even though Ian had been insistent that the disposal plan only concerned Edward Evans, that it had been written that night when they were making a plan to get rid of Edward Evans' body, this was proof that that disposal plan had been written before and had probably been used for other bodies. Thursday, October 21st, the day after the prayer book and the ticket inside of it were discovered, both Ian and Myra were charged with the murder of Leslie Ann Downey, though they both insisted that they were not guilty of it. Officer Massheader, who was a crime scene police officer, he was called to Saddleworth Moor by Mounsey and asked to bring his camera. He was brought to a place on the moor where Mounsey thought that the picture with Myra holding Puppet and looking down at him, was taken. To confirm Moundsey's theory, Masshedder took a picture with his own camera, and they compared the pictures afterwards, and they were identical. They pushed a stick into the ground and smelled the end of it, and when the scent of decomposition was found on the stick, they started digging. Only 9 inches down, they found a child's black shoe. A few more inches down, they found socks. And further down, what appeared to be a child's foot. Moundsey looked down at their discovery with a heavy heart, and he told the other officers to go back to the station and tell Arthur Benfield that they had found John Kilbride. Even before they had confirmed that it was John Kilbride, Moundsey knew. After so much time searching for him, never giving up, keeping the case alive and open, Moundsey had finally found his boy. John Kilbride was found only 371 yards away from where Leslie had been buried. He had been fully clothed except for his underwear and pants, which were found on his back. His body was too decomposed to identify what the cause of death was. John Kilbride's family did not feel relieved when they heard the news, because before they heard the news, there had still been a glimmer of hope that he was alive, that he was out there somewhere, and they would be able to see him again. Sheila Kilbride had to identify her son, and she was only able to determine it was him from the clothes he was wearing. Clothes she had purchased and laundered for him, little buttons shaped like footballs on his jacket that she'd sewn on herself. Once again, after the discovery of John Kilbride, the search on the moors was extended, but the weather was not in their favor. At night, it got extremely cold, and a thick layer of frost would greet search parties in the morning. As the day progressed, that frost would condense into a milky and soupy fog that made visibility very difficult. They brought in Air Force jets with infrared to help, but on October 30th, the search was postponed due to heavy rain and winds. And after that, the search never picked up with as much energy as it had before. The police were building their case against Ian and Myra. They confirmed that the pictures of Leslie had been taken in Myra's room and had been taken with Ian's camera. And after they finished at Wardlebrook Avenue, they started on David Smith's home, the one he shared with his father, and that mean old landlady that he kicked down the stairs a couple of times. They pulled up floorboards, they stripped wallpaper, they searched everywhere for forensic evidence. They found some blood near a window in the kitchen, but David Smith claimed that he had cut himself while he was replacing the glass in that window. And Pauline Reed's mother, Joan Reed, who still lived only a few doors down from David Smith at this time, she confirmed that story because she had been the one to bandage his hand after he'd heard it that day. This had happened only 2 months after Pauline had gone missing. They didn't find anything at Ian Brady's home that he had shared with his mother and stepfather. They found nothing. Ian's mother, his birth mother, Maggie, she was not there. She'd escaped to Scotland, and she was staying with the Sloanes. She was crushed when she heard what her son was being accused of, and she was constantly being hounded by the media. Patrick, Ian's stepfather, was there, and he allowed the police to search wherever they wanted, but like I said, they found absolutely nothing. At the next remand hearing, Myra was again surprised to see so many more angry people standing outside the courtroom, shouting things like "child killer" and "monsters" at her and Ian as they were walked inside. Afterwards, when Ian and Myra were being put back into the car that would take them back to Risley Remand Center, Leslie and Downey's uncle Terrence rushed towards them, intending to kill them. But they were being protected, number one. The car was being protected by police because there had been many death threats, and there's obviously a lot of angry people who would have liked to see Ian and Myra's life come to an end. Not only that, but because of the amount of violence and ferocity that the crowds had and the amount of hatred that Ian and Myra were receiving on a daily basis, Ian and Myra were still in the courtroom waiting for everything to die down. They had brought decoys out to this car. It wasn't even really them. Afterwards, Ian and Myra were questioned about the death of John Kilbride, and Ian claimed he knew nothing about the pictures of him and Myra on the moors being trophies or grave markers of any kind. Even when confronted of the picture of Myra sitting directly on top of John's grave, he denied it. When Myra was asked about the picture, she claimed that, yeah, Ian had probably taken it, but David Smith also took pictures of her a lot on the moor, which wasn't true at all. When they asked her, well, what are you looking at? She was like, oh, I'm looking down at my dog, Puppet. And they're like, listen, lady, you're clearly not looking at your dog. You're clearly looking down at the ground where a young boy's buried underneath you. And she responded, they are just pictures. They have no significance whatsoever. In this interview, Myra tried to throw David Smith under the bus again, and she claimed that he was one of the men who had arrived at their house with Leslie that night. This did match Ian's story a little bit. However, Ian and Myra had both met privately right before this with Ian's lawyer, so it's very possible that they got together when they were with the lawyer and they talked about what they were going to tell the police and how they were going to make sure their stories matched up. It was them against David Smith at this point. Ian pretty much knew he was going to go away, but he was hoping that Myra would be able to get off, and he could put David Smith in prison with him. Myra was stone cold. She wasn't giving the police anything, so they left the room and they came back in with a photo album they had made specifically for her. It was a photo album that contained pictures that she and Ian had taken on the moor. It contained basic landscapes, and it also contained pictures that were taken of their victims post-mortem. It was meant to surprise her and throw her off balance. They obviously weren't going to tell her those pictures were in there. They just asked her to flip through and tell them what she thought about the pictures. And when she got to the pictures of Leslie and John Kilbride, she got visibly upset and she asked for them to be taken away. She didn't want to see them anymore. The problem was they didn't have anything on Myra when it came to the deaths of John Kilbride and Leslie Ann Downey. If she didn't confess, if she didn't give them something, they really didn't have a lot to say that she'd committed the murders. They could place her there at the death of Leslie Ann Downey because her voice was on the tape recorder. But her voice on that tape recorder couldn't prove that she was there at the time Leslie had been killed. Even her crouching on John Kilbride's grave, they could not prove that she knew she was crouching over the burial site of a young boy. Now, Poppet was brought to the vet to be put under anesthetic. Poppet was Myra's dog, her beloved dog. He was brought to the vet to be put under anesthetic because they wanted to compare Poppet's age at that time to Poppet's age in the picture of Myra and Poppet over John Kilbride's grave. And unfortunately, as he was under anesthetic, he had some heart issues and he didn't wake up. Myra was heartbroken and she was furious and she raged that the police were murderers. And I almost have to wonder if there might be a little truth to this, because I understand you can get the age of a dog from maybe x-raying its teeth or whatever they need to do. You can get the dog's age at that time, but how would they know how old Poppet had been in the picture of Myra and Ian? Even if it was dated, that date would have been just Myra and Ian arbitrarily dating the picture. So I almost wonder if there's something to it, that maybe they thought showing her they had control over her, to take away the only thing that she cared about, would break her and make her confess to something. The last day of the Moor search was November 10th, even though Mounsey vehemently opposed its ending. There was an evidentiary trial in December to basically see if there was enough evidence to go to an actual trial. David Smith was given immunity in his part of the cleanup and the cover-up of Edward Evans' death and body in order for his testimony against Myra and Ian. Maureen also took the stand and testified that her sister had never really liked babies or children. As she was giving this testimony, Myra was glaring at her and Maureen couldn't look her sister in the eye. Throughout this process, Myra stayed vain and concerned with her appearance. She had her lawyer submit a request to the court that her hair be bleached again because her dark roots were coming through and the press were making comments about her. And she asked one of her prison guards if he could give her some makeup so she could get her face ready before she went to court. Instead, he handed her a cup of tea that he had poured salt into. On December 20th, it was determined in that evidentiary trial that there was enough evidence to go to an actual trial in the deaths of Edward Evans, John Kilbride, and Leslie Ann Downey. Around Christmas, Ian's lawyer gave both Ian and Myra a book of poetry, and he left them alone in the room together for a little bit so they could have some time together. At this time, Ian gave Myra a notebook that was coded in only a way that she could understand. In the notebook were letters that Ian had written Myra. Each one was dated, and if the date was underlined, she would know that that specific letter contained a message for her, a secret message. The 7th and 8th word of every line would have to be separated and then put back together, and that would form its own secret story. These stories were about violence and cruelty to children. They made a plan to get married, specifically so that Myra would not be able to testify against Ian. Thankfully, this request was denied. It just seems so crazy to me how Ian was so opposed to marriage and society and societal norms. And as soon as it benefits him, he is very willing to throw his beliefs, his staunch beliefs, right out the window if it benefits him. Before the trial started, Ann West, Alan West, and Ann West's brother visited the home of David and Maureen Smith. All three of them had been drinking, and when David Smith let them in, Ann West began to talk to him about how it was very important that he tell the truth at the trial. She wanted to make sure that Ian would never get away with it. David Smith assured her that he had a mutual interest in seeing Ian kept behind bars, and as they were talking, Ann West kept looking at Maureen and staring at her, which made Maureen very nervous. So she excused herself. She went to the kitchen to make some tea. But when she came back with the tea, Ann West charged her and pushed her against the wall. Maureen began protecting her stomach and saying, I'm pregnant, don't hurt me, I have a baby inside of me. David went after Ann West to pull her off his wife, and when David went for Ann, Alan went for David. Hearing a commotion, David Smith's father ran in, and then he started getting in a fight with Ann West's brother. So they were all brawling in this house, and finally, they got Alan West, and Ann's brother out of the house. And as they walked away, they yelled back towards David Smith and Maureen and said, you're just the same as them. You're just as bad as them. You should all be hung. At the end of March, Myra, who often wrote letters to her mother while she was imprisoned, wrote a letter to her mother and said that she'd finally been allowed to have her hair bleached. And she looked so good. She was kind of mad she had no place to go. Oh, you got someplace to go, girl. Don't worry. You're going someplace. The trial started on Tuesday, April 19th, 1966, in the town of Chester, the main town of Cheshire County. With so much media and public attention, they had planned on broadcasting the trial, but in the end decided that the details were not fit for television and they would only air the verdicts. Sir Frederick Elwyn Jones was the lead prosecutor, and a fitting one for the likes of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. He had been a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, bringing Nazis to justice for war crimes. They had brought out the big guns for these two. Although Ian and Myra's lawyers had requested that the two of them be tried separately, this request was denied, and the trial went on with Ian and Myra being prosecuted as one at the same time. Maureen took the stand first in this trial. She was farther along in her pregnancy now, so they kind of wanted to get her testimony out of the way because she could have the baby any day. She stated that her sister did in fact shop at Ashton-under-Lyne Market, even though she claimed she had never been there. Later on, Nellie, Myra's mother, would refute this and say that Maureen was lying and Myra had never been to Ashton-under-Lyne. Maureen talked about the timeline of the night Edward Evans was murdered, what time Myra and David Smith left their house, what time David got back, the condition of him, etc. And something else interesting came up that did not help David Smith's case with the public. According to Maureen's testimony, her husband was receiving 20 pounds a week from a national newspaper for his stories. After the trial, they would receive 1,000 pounds, and the couple had already taken a vacation to France, paid for by the paper. According to David, he was seen in his town, in the city, by the public as the third Moor's murderer, and he could not get a job. So this was all he could do. He had to sell what he had, his story, his one-on-one first-hand experience with Ian and Myra to the paper in order to pay the bills and make a living. When this information was released to the public, it made David look even worse, and they hated him even more. They went through the evidence of Edward Evans, John Kilbride, and Leslie Ann Downey, while Ian and Myra sat together and played games on notebooks and giggled. Even though Ian stuck to his story about David being the one to bring Leslie there and leaving with her while she was still alive, he slipped up during his testimony, and he said, I placed a handkerchief over her mouth right before the end. When the judge questioned him about this and was like, before the end of what? The end? I thought she left your house alive, dude. Ian stuttered and tried to regain his composure, but the damage was done. At least at this point, Ian did protect Myra, even though later, after the trial, after they were both in prison, he would change his tune drastically. He said the only reason that she had been involved was because he'd forced her. She'd never wanted to do it, but he made her. Myra wrote to her mother again during this trial and said that it was just so nice, to have met a nice boy who was more concerned with her fate than his own. She said, quote, I believe in one thing though, no matter how black things look, someday we can begin together again. Their plan was to get Myra a lighter sentence so that she could travel the world and allow Ian to live vicariously through the letters she sent him. When Myra was questioned at the trial, she was very remorseful. She said she felt bad about her treatment of little Leslie Ann Downey. The only reason she had been speaking to her so sharply and so meanly was so the neighbors wouldn't hear her yelling. I'm not sure if Myra thought this made her look better. I wasn't really being mean to her. I just didn't want the neighbors to hear her while she was being abused and murdered by my boyfriend. She also claimed that her presence there was specifically so she could ensure that Leslie left unharmed and alive. But she was so disturbed by what was happening that she ended up looking out the window the whole time and she didn't see anything. Even though she was in the same room, because she happened to be looking out the window, she had no idea what happened. Same room, small ass little bedroom, looking out the window, no idea what happened because you can't hear, you don't have ears. Sir Frederick Elwyn Jones told Myra that she should have treated Leslie the way a woman should treat a child, to which she responded, "I should have done, but I didn't." The trial lasted only 14 days. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. And when they came back, Ian Brady was found guilty of the murder of Eddie Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride. However, Myra was only found guilty in the murders of Edward Evans and Leslie. The death penalty in the UK had been abolished literally the month after they were arrested. A month after they were arrested, in November of 1965. So they were both sentenced to life in prison. They saw each other one last time while being let out of court before being put into 2 different prisons. Myra went to Holloway Prison in London, where it was soon considered safe to integrate her into Gen Pop. In Gen Pop, she was subsequently attacked several times. She requested to be put into solitary confinement, but instead they gave her a prison guard shadow who would follow her around when she was out of her cell and make sure no one bothered her. A week after the conviction, Myra appealed based on the fact that she had been tried conjointly with Ian and that it had been a disservice to her. Her appeal was denied. Ian Brady was sent to Durham Prison, and after being attacked several times, he was placed in solitary confinement permanently. Ian and Myra requested visits with each other, but these were denied, and they continued their relationship through letters. In one of these letters, Myra wrote to Ian, "Smith must die, Maureen too." "Okay, Myra, feeling all big and bad in prison." Maureen Hindley, or Maureen Smith, did make an attempt to contact her sister and write her letters in jail, apologizing not for telling the truth or for getting her in trouble, but essentially their relationship had been a close one. Their whole lives they'd been best friends and sisters. And now Maureen saw that Myra had crossed a line that should not have been crossed, and she couldn't stand next to her anymore. Maureen never got a response to these letters because Myra could hold a grudge like no other, I guess. After Myra and Ian were safely behind bars, David and Maureen became bigger targets for the locals and the people in their neighborhood. Every day they woke up to more graffiti on their house, things like "child killers live here." They were barely able to leave the house. When Maureen had to go to the store with her new baby son to go shopping, she was spit on. And David Smith would not leave during the day. He waited until night fell when he felt like he could walk around the neighborhood when nobody else was awake. And that was the only time he could leave the house or get out without being harassed or attacked or have people yelling terrible things at him. When David did get a job, it was protested. He showed up for his first day and people were standing outside with signs. So he basically turned around and went home, and there was special circumstances made so that David could begin to collect Social Security and he wouldn't have to get a job because it was pretty much not safe for him to do so, which is ironic to me because the little boy who refused to accept a free lunch at school was now a grown man who was forced to accept Social Security far before his time. Eventually, David went to prison for stabbing a man who attacked him in regards to the murders again. He immediately went and turned himself in, and he served 3 years for this attack. He and Maureen had 2 more children, but they both began using drugs and alcohol very heavily, and it was just a really bad situation. Their lives did not turn out well. In October of 1980, at only 34 years old, Maureen Hindley suffered a brain hemorrhage and she died. While David Smith was in prison for stabbing another man, Maureen left him, and when David got out, he attempted to kill himself. David Smith found himself in court again in 1972. He had been accused of killing his father. David Smith had given his father a glass of milk laced with barbiturates because he was dying of cancer, and it had been his request. He was convicted of manslaughter for this and sentenced to 2 days of imprisonment. After his divorce with Maureen, David Smith moved to Hyde, and in 1975, he married a woman named Mary Flaherty, and they had a daughter together. Unfortunately, as a lifelong smoker, David Smith did suffer from cancer, and on May 5th, 2012, he died at the age of 64. When the public found that Myra had been allowed a transfer from the prison to Risley Remand Center to visit with her grandmother who was dying in February of 1968, they were outraged. The public was pissed. A woman who had committed such horrendous acts should never be allowed to have any scrap of human decency. And it wasn't until 1970 that Myra claimed the spell Ian had over her had broken. She found God again, of course. And she had begun relationships with different women while she was in prison. One of these women was a prison guard named Patricia Carnes. Carnes claims that when she met Myra, she didn't know what she was in prison for, which I don't believe for a second. You work at the prison, you're a prison guard. Myra Hindley is like the most notorious female killer in the UK besides Rosemary West. How did you not know who she was? But anyway, she said she found out later, months later, when Myra told her, but by that point, what could she do? She was already in love. The heart wants what it wants, even if it's a child killer. Patricia Carnes had been a nun before she was a prison guard, and she and Myra began a love affair, exchanging letters and having illicit trysts in the prison chapel. One day, another inmate named Pat Ali, she was found with a 5-pound note hidden in a pen. And when she was asked where she got it from, she said she'd been given it by Patricia Carnes because she was the go-between between Myra and Carnes in their relationship. Of course, Myra denied this all and said that Pat Ali was just a liar and trying to get Patricia Carnes into trouble. So the inmate, Pat, who had told the truth, she was actually reprimanded for making up lies and slandering the name of a prison guard. Hindley and Carnes had a plan. They were going to go away together and be missionaries in San Paulo, but in order for this dream to come true, Myra had to be out of prison, and Patty Carnes was going to make that happen. Rumors began to circulate of the prison break plan, and one of Carnes' co-workers turned her in. She had been shown love letters between the two, and she thought it was harmless, but when she found out there was a plan to break Myra out, she couldn't look the other way anymore. Patricia Carnes was sentenced to 6 years in prison for her part of the plan, because Myra Hindley destroys every life that she touches. In recent years, it has come out that the escape Myra planned included much more than just starting a new life with her lover. Police went to the prison and conducted a 5-week investigation after having Pat Carnes under surveillance and seeing her meet with an affiliate of the IRA for a burger. The investigation, which concluded in the idea that Hindley had probably been planning on also freeing IRA bombers Dolores and Marion Price, 2 sisters who attacked the Old Bailey in 1973, killing 1 person and injuring 200. Ian Brady had begun a series of protests in 1969 to try and get conjugal visits for him and Myra. Basically, he stopped eating, he went on hunger strikes, he starved himself. When she broke off their relationship in a letter in 1970 and told him she'd converted back to catechism, he continued the hunger strikes. Sometimes he would even pour a ridiculous amount of salt on his food to make himself vomit so he could go to sickbay. But once he knew Myra was done with him, his love, dedication, and loyalty faded very quickly. And when he found out that she was appealing to get out, he didn't like that at all. For some reason, this man, the Earl of Longford, otherwise known as Lord Longford, he got deeply involved in the cases of both Ian and Myra. He was a supporter of penal reform, and he visited Brady in prison often to try and keep him in touch with the outside world. He even campaigned heavily to have Myra Hindley released altogether, saying she was only an accomplice and had not committed the murders herself. He was the only visitor Ian ever had in prison until 1984.
Lord Longford is talking about parole for Myra Hindley. When will I get parole? I am serving a life sentence to that monster. When will I get my parole? I've said this to Lord Longford once, and I'll say it again. She will be one dead woman.
She may not like me, but I know Mrs. Weston. I sympathise with her enormously, of course. But she's been grossly exploited by the press and the television too. Over the years, they trot her out and on all these occasions. I think that it was cruel, behaving very cruelly to her. I mean, to keep alive that degree of hatred, the corrosive hatred, the terrible thing. No, I'm tremendously sorry for her, but the idea of letting her decide Myra's fate would be ludicrous.
But in 1984, Ian met with journalist Fred Harrison at Gartree Prison. Even though Ian and Myra had been suspected of being involved in the disappearances of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, nobody had ever been able to prove it. But Harrison, over the course of several months and 8 meetings with Ian Brady, he finally got it out of him. When Fred first met Ian, he was shocked by his appearance. 20 years in prison had not been kind to him, and he said he looked like a man of 70. He was basically skin and bone, with sunken-in cheeks and stooped over. As they talked and chain-smoked, Ian happily reminisced about his time on the moors with Myra, the fresh air and the clear water, his happy place of openness and nature that he would never see again. On his second meeting with him in 1985, Fred asked Ian about Myra. Would she ever get out of prison? Ian answered that if he expanded on the events that had occurred during their mad years together, she wouldn't get out in 100 years. And when Harrison asked him what kind of things, Ian pointed to the newspaper clipping Fred had with him about the families of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett still looking for closure, and Myra Hindley making an appeal for parole. Ian looked at the clipping and said things like that, suggesting that Myra was involved in the disappearances of Keith and Pauline, and directly implicating himself in those crimes as well. At this point, Ian knew he was never going to get out. He was in prison for life, but he didn't want Myra to get out either. They were in this together, even if she didn't want to be anymore. Ian also claimed at this meeting that David Smith and Maureen, his wife, they were more involved than they admitted to, even more involved than Ian himself. According to Ian, David Smith had essentially been responsible entirely for Pauline Reed, referring to her as the girl who lived 2 doors down from him. He even went so far as to say that Pauline Reed had died in David Smith's home, and since the house itself had since been demolished, the police would never be able to prove it. In 1987, Ian and Myra officially confessed to the murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. Myra, in an effort to show she was really sorry, guys, and to secure a bit for her parole, she was brought out to Saddleworth Moor so she could hopefully point out where they had buried Keith and Pauline. Pauline Reed's body was discovered as a result of this visit to Saddleworth Moor, and her family were finally able to lay her body to rest and have a proper funeral for the little girl they had lost for over 2 decades. Even though it was believed that both Ian and Myra knew the location of where Keith Bennett was, they never told a soul. It did not help locate his body, and Keith's family is still looking to this day. Alan Bennett, Keith's brother, even visited Myra Hindley in prison twice, showing her pictures of the moors, begging for her to give some sort of insight into where his brother could be. She cried and hugged him and said she was sorry for all the trouble she had caused. She told Keith's brother, even though she'd never touched Keith, she still felt, responsible, because she's the one who put him in the car. You think? Yes, you're responsible. She gave him some areas she thought Keith might be, but those never panned out, of course not. I am of the belief that Ian and Myra's last dark deed was a stab at the family of Keith Bennett. Ian and Myra had lost their freedom. They'd lost their ability to commit the crimes that they needed to feel good and to feel alive. And they wanted to regain control over the situation in some way. And hiding and holding on to where Keith Bennett's body was buried was the only way they could. Winnie Bennett died in 2012, never being able to bury her son. She spoke publicly a week before she died, saying that finding Keith was her last dying wish. She said, "I want Brady to know I've got cancer, and if he has any decency or respect for himself or me, he will tell me where Keith is before anything happens to me." On May 15th, 2017, Ian Brady died. He was at Ashworth Hospital where he was being given end-of-life care. He was 79 years old, and he had been given and allowed many, many years that he had stolen from innocent children. And then at the end, they gave him, feeding tubes and oxygen to help him stay alive as long as possible. He was given respect and courtesy and allowed to die in a kind way, something that he took away from every single one of his victims, and something, in my opinion, as savage as it may sound, I don't think he deserved that. He should have been left to die in his cell like a dog, alone, on the floor, and in pain. Now, for some reason, Ian Brady was allowed to have his 2 suitcases with him in that hospital room. And his dying request was that they be taken away and locked away in storage and never opened. Why? Why was he allowed to have that? Why was he allowed to have that request? Why does he get any rights at all? When Alan, Keith's brother, tried to get access to the suitcases after Ian died, and Myra, who died in 2012 at the age of 60, they were both dead, Alan Bennett wanted to have access to the suitcases because he thought there might be something in there that would lead them to Keith's body. But his requests have been denied over and over again. Basically, they say since both Ian and Myra are dead, there's no way to prosecute them for anything, so there's no point in digging it all up and going through that. Why the law is not allowing access to Ian Brady's suitcases, not allowing Keith Bennett's family the closure that they deserve. Maybe you can't prosecute these 2 people any longer, but at least you can bring Keith home and let him have a proper burial before every single person that knew him is dead and there's nobody left to look for him. The fight is currently still going on now, so hopefully Alan wins. He's allowed to get in those suitcases. Hopefully whatever he finds in there will lead to the recovery of Keith's body. But it's a sad world we live in when the rights of a dead child murderer trump the rights of a victim's family. Another interesting piece of this puzzle is that there may have been more victims of Ian and Myra, victims we don't even know about, because there were many who got away. Tommy Radigan was just 7 when he claims he was approached by Ian and Myra while he was swinging alone at the playground. He said Myra smelled good, strongly of perfume, and that she spoke to him kindly, asked him if he was hungry, and he was kind of a street kid at this point, didn't have a good home life, wasn't eating meals regularly, so yeah, he was hungry, and he went home with her. But as soon as he got in the house, he sensed there was something wrong. He could hear Myra and Ian speaking sharply to each other. Myra's demeanor had changed from kind and sweet to kind of rough and sharp. So he was like, I gotta get out of here. And he tried crawling out of the kitchen window. When Myra Hindley came in, saw him escaping, and yelled, "He is getting away," and grabbed his leg. Luckily, Tommy Radigan got away, and he ran away from that house, and he never looked back. Another man, David Gray, claims he was 10 years old when he was approached by Ian at a candy store, and Ian pretended to be a police officer and said that he needed David to come with him because he had to ask him questions. And when David asked to see some identification, Ian laughed, and David stepped back, kind of afraid, and he made the bell on the door of the candy store jingle. And then Myra walked up and was like, "Ian, we have to go. Come on, let's go," because the kid had called too much attention by making the door jingle. So if people looked over, they would have seen Ian and Myra talking to this kid, and then maybe would have put them together later. And you know how concerned Ian was with never having any connection. So this kid, if this story is true and valid, he escaped with his life as well. This is one of the saddest cases I've ever done. It was really difficult, especially considering these kids. I just feel so bad. I feel bad for their families. You can actually put yourself in the position of these kids' families and understand the loss and the hurt and the heartache that you never, ever get rid of. That never goes away and never gets better. In my opinion, I don't know if this is debated. I think that a lot of people do debate, even now that Myra Hindley's dead, Ian Brady's dead. A lot of people say that she was a victim of his. She claims that she was abused by him, and that's why she did what he wanted her to do. Apparently, Myra had handed over some private documents hours before she died, which concerned her relationship with Ian. She claims she was violently raped by him, strangled by him, beaten by him, and when she asked him why he was so rough with her, why he was hurting her, why he was strangling her so much, he said it was because he was practicing. She claims she was coerced into taking part in these murders because he threatened to kill her or hurt her if she didn't. Honestly, I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe a word of it. That girl or woman was a stone cold bitch. She had some huge issues. She was just as bad as he was. I don't care if she never touched one of those kids, even though I don't believe that either. She was just as bad as he was, because the fact is there was a lot of things she could have done. Look what David Smith did. She could have gone to the police anytime, and with what she knew and what she had on Ian would have gone away for life. So she wanted to be with Ian. She loved Ian. She had put him on a pedestal. She had idolized him for a year before he even looked at her. She built him up to such high levels because he was so much more, cultured and intelligent than all the guys she knew, and he represented for her a way out of this small town life where you get married and you have kids and that's it. He represented something different to her, that appealed to her, that she wanted. There was a darkness in her. There is something dark about this woman. There is something tragic inside of her. And just as I said with Charles Manson and his girls and his followers, you don't take a normal person who has no interest in killing, who's not violent, who values human life, and tell them, go kill this person, or go get this person from me so I can kill them and you can watch. And that normal person is not going to go do that. A person who already has that darkness inside of them, who's already been thinking about it, who's already been playing with the idea of hurting someone or being a part of something that takes somebody else's life, a person like that is going to be on board for that. A normal person is going to be like, you're crazy. At least with Manson family, they were all on drugs, so you don't know where their heads were at. Myra Hindley was completely sober as a judge. I mean, she was drunk often. They drank a lot, but come on. I don't care how many glasses of wine you give me, how many Nazi books you put in my hand. I'm never going to say, okay, I see your point. It's a good idea to kill kids. Myra was just as guilty. It's a good thing neither of them ever got out. I don't know what would have happened if Myra had even been allowed to, appeal her conviction and be released. She probably would have been murdered by the public, honestly. She probably wouldn't have made it long. But we thought that about Casey Anthony too, and she seems to be doing all right. Anyways, I'm gonna wrap that up here. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you, any of you, openly and honestly tell me, do you think there's a chance that Myra was not as evil as Ian? Or if she wasn't evil at all, and she was just manipulated and controlled and convinced to do this against her will? Let me know if any of you think that. This is an open place. We can talk honestly. The thing I love about this community is that we can disagree and we never get into it with each other. It's always a completely respectful and open discourse, and I love that. Thank you guys so much for being here. As always, I appreciate you beyond words. Stay kind and stay beautiful, and I'll see you next time.